All right, part two with Jesse Prinz. And so I've got a bunch of stuff that I have written down. I spent quite a while just doing bullet points. I've read most of your book. I haven't read it all. It's pretty dense. And um,
I'm definitely in the bad habit of writing for a very academic audience, so
yeah.
really not been a high enough priority for me, but that's why we're doing this.
Yeah, totally. No, I like it though. And same with, I mean, like Sapolsky Behave, that book is pretty dense too, but it's like, really
Yeah,
awesome.
it is dense. He's writing, it's a long book and he's covering an amazing amount of ground, and it's definitely written with cutting edge scholarship in mind, so he's not dumbing it down in that respect.
How could you possibly dumb down something like that anyways? It just doesn't seem like you could.
Well, I mean, the flip side of it, there's one sense in which it is dumbed down, which is not because he's writing for a broad audience. It's because of the nature of his field, which is that behavioral neuroscience is in an embryonic state, and what we know about brain areas relating to behavior is still pretty limited, and he's careful about that. He regularly hedges and says, this is complex, this is complex, this is complex.
Mm-hmm.
We don't know all the causes, but still the idea that we can say, okay, the amygdala is about, fear or something like that. Or the amygdala, I guess, for him is more about aggression, simplifies things quite a bit. And I think he's done a very good job of doing those simplifications in a way that constantly reminds people that this is a simplification.
Wouldn't he say that the amygdala starts with fear and then leads to aggression, maybe?
Yeah. I mean,
Okay.
It's a way of seeing them two as belong together. But the idea that any brain, that this tiny pair of nuclei in the brain is a fear center, when if you put somebody in a scanner and induce fear, you see, huge swaths of the brain active. You put them in two different scary situations, social fear and physical fear, or even two different kinds of physical threats. You see really different patterns of activity.
Mm-hmm.
Likewise for aggression. So any formula linking fear to aggression in a predictable way, any formula linking a brain area to a specific emotion wouldn't hold up. It's definitely clear from his book that this is small part of the story, and obviously the biology matters. We're not ghosts in the machine. We need the brain to get it done, and everything we do has a neural correlate. But I do think once you start taking an English word like fear or aggression and mapping it onto the brain, just as he points out when he's talking about genes, the mapping is going to be really messy.
Right. Yeah, that's one thing I really like about him is he tries to do away with the buckets, as he calls them, like grouping, I think even in Behave, or maybe because I've read all of his books, but maybe in Behave, I'm pretty sure it's Behave, he talks about how if you were to ask the question, why did the chicken cross the road? You're going to get a neuroscientist saying, well, because there were neurons in the brain that fired, that led him to make the body movement of crossing the road. And then you might get an anthropologist that says, societal pressures tell the chicken to cross the road because it's better over there or whatever. And then if you get evolutionary biologists, they're going to say, the chicken crossed the road because there's a female chicken on the other, or a rooster on the other side, and the genes propelled the, So it's interesting how he tries to say to get away from the idea that everything is just points in one specific area.
I agree. I think he's good on that. I definitely think that kind of book that brings in all these different disciplines together is exactly what we need. And people, even in their kind of professional academic work, get so channeled into their method that they often forget to look at what's going on in the next department. Mm-hmm. And that's where we make mistakes. There's a famous parable about somebody who's walking, who's on the street at night and searching on the ground underneath a street light. And a policeman stops and says, did you lose something? And the guy says, yeah, I lost my wallet. He says, oh, you dropped it here? He said, oh, no, but this is where the light is. And, so we so often have these tools maybe in this case, neuroscience would be that tool, and we know how to use that. So we're trying to understand something really complex, like human violence and aggression, by using this tool, because that's where the light is. But if we step back and think about it, that's not where the violence is, or it's not, it's one cog in a very complex causal story. Violence isn't located in anyone's head, it's located in the brain, situated in a complex historical environment.
Okay, so I really want to get back to this because that's actually something that I want to talk to you about. But
Great.
I first want to start, this is where I wanted to start anyways. I first want to start with Steven Pinker, because I have read Steven Pinker's books, and I've enjoyed them, never really thought too deeply about it, never really had much of an opinion on it. I'm kind of a pessimist, so I don't feel in my internal, in my heart or whatever, that things are getting spectacularly better. But then again, I've only been alive for 30 years, so it's hard to judge. And that's, I've always thought about that as the mistake that I'm making, is that even though I don't see that, that could just be a failure of me to comprehend the history of humans, essentially. Now, after talking to you over email, you just mentioned to me, something about Yuval Noah Harari and how he kind of calls out Pinker, which, is true. But I didn't really think about it until it was 2 a.m. in the morning. I couldn't sleep. And all of a sudden, this idea popped in my head that he neglects, and I think that I had started reading Discipline and Punish, right? Is that the name of it? Mm-hmm. I always say Crime and Punishment because I've read that too. But so after I started reading that, this idea came in my head, holy shit, yeah, it's getting better by these few metrics, but we have the highest incarceration rate in the world, in the United States.
Yeah.
The numbers might be going down, but we have more people enslaved to that system. We've got extreme levels of poverty still, yet we have the highest GDP in the world.
Yeah.
We've got tons of people uninsured that literally die every year because they can't take the preventative action that they need for things like cancer or, thyroid disease or something like that. I don't know. And then you look across the world, and, his big claim is that by the free markets and getting, call centers over to India, we're able to take these people that, might have just been picking beans before and making 10 cents a day. Now they're making $1 a day. Isn't that great? And they're lifted out of poverty. And, but it fails to show how the American corporations that are doing this are completely exploiting those people. And they are benefiting hugely on the despair that looks better than before. So it's it's really weird thing where it's maybe it's slightly better than before, but we're not acknowledging the fact that these CEOs of these companies they're creating huge amounts of wealth, and they're not paying people what I would consider a ethical wage, maybe internationally. And it's not it's this weird hand trick almost, it's they're saying, look, aren't we great, we're able to pay these people $1 a day. They were making 10 cents before, but they could be paying them $10 an hour and still be making better profits than they do in the United States. You know what I'm saying? So yeah, I don't know if you want to talk about that.
Yeah, I agree. I think the whole thing is a kind of hand trick. I mean, first of all, it depends where you zoom in. So if you want to show we're making progress by some measure, and you have a kind of irregular curve, you can zoom into any part of that and say, okay, here it's looking good. So if you want to talk about, say, industrialization, the start of the Industrial Revolution brought human misery to sort of an unprecedented, level, putting aside sort of times of devastating epidemic or global war. Industrialization was probably the worst thing that happened to humanity, and when it first occurred. And then things for the wealthy for first to industrialize got better for a great many people, but not for everyone. And that success of the successful, the success of the wealthy, continues to ride on the backs of people in the developing world. So if you measure, the standard of living in the post-industrial West, and say, see how great capitalism is, see how great modern technology is, see how great is. These are all the things that Pinker credits with our success, open markets. You have to remember that success depends on exploitation of other parts of the world where quality of life has gone down precipitously. But not only that, if you look at his measures of success, you can zoom in on, say, the last 100 years and see some improvement of things he's interested in, like crime, capital crime rates. But if you look at other things, you mentioned mass incarceration, but another obvious one is impending mass unemployment through mechanization or automation of every sector of labor. Look at destruction of the planet, and look at market instability and the various crashes we've had. You can start to find there are a lot of, kinks and chinks and cracks in this armor. And the idea that this slope that looks so great when you zoom in is going to steadily go upward and upward neglects the fact that as it goes up, somebody else is going down, and it's going to get to a point which, like the top of a roller coaster, can only lead one way, and it's not further up. So I do think there's an enormous bit of subterfuge. There's questionable data, like he says, for instance, that the Second World War killed fewer people than the rate of homicide in small-scale societies. And he cites some work on pre-colonial Papua New Guinea, where estimates of homicide rates for some groups were alarmingly high. But he neglects a vast literature on small-scale societies showing that, first of all, among hunter-gatherers, there's massive variation, but also that among the majority of them, people actually do live more peacefully and better. And the case studies that he looks at have been challenged as partially consequences of colonial contact, which led to group competition of a much more violent kind than had been observed before. So, I think Pinker is invested in a view, and the view is that we are doing better because of the institutions we have, the economic system we have, the politics we have. That's a scientific claim. There are very good ways to test that claim. Pinker is not a historian. He's not a sociologist. He's a linguist. He's a psycholinguist. This is way beyond his area of expertise. There's massive literature on all these things. And the story is complex. The story is messy. And the story in many, many cases is quite depressing. Take something as simple as your hypothesis, you being Pinker, the hypothesis that democracy leads to improvement in human life. And take his favorite measure, which is homicide rates. Well, if you look at homicide rates in Japan, they're among the lowest in the world. But Japan has basically been a one-party system since the war. Look at homicide rates in Franco's Spain, which aside from political disappearances, were also extremely low. Good fascists are very good at bringing down crime rates. So if you want to do that science, the social science of crime compared to political system has a very simple design. Look at variation in political systems, variation in crime rates, and see which political systems correlate with better outcomes. And if you do that exercise, you find that A, capitalism, and B, democracy have nothing to do with it. Pinker's book is more or less a effort to rewrite a book that was written in the 1930s by a German scholar called Norbert Elias, called The Civilizing Process. And Elias documents how things like crime, but also table manners and general etiquette have improved over the last couple of centuries. But Elias is not telling a progress narrative. When he says they improve by our standards, because we like it when people sort of, eat in our polite way, which is with a napkin at the table, wiping their mouth at every turn. But Norbert doesn't put a value on this. He doesn't say that's better or worse. They're just different societal patterns, different forms of organization. And as Foucault would say in Discipline and Punish, they're different forms of control. Today we look at torture, and we look at penal torture, and we look at incarceration. Incarceration, we say, oh, that's much more humane. But in fact, physically hurting somebody versus taking away their liberty is not obviously worse. And if we had public spectacles of torture where people could come and watch a criminal get physically harmed, but then allow that criminal to go on back into society and live out their life, the claim that that's worse than what we have today, I think, is very, very questionable. And the point is not that prison is worse than that. It's just that these are all different solutions to the same problem, which is how to control people. And one form of power is not necessarily more humane than another form of power, just because we find it more aesthetic to look at by our contemporary standards.
Yeah, it's actually just kind of drive that point home. It's kind of like trash, you know, like if people litter, it looks gross, but if they just like put it in a landfill, then it looks better, but there's still a bunch of shit out there. And,
exactly.
Yeah.
And the shit in the landfill is a perfect analogy for incarceration, because like there are countries, Singapore, for instance, practices caning. And every once in a while, it makes headlines here because a Westerner ends up getting prosecuted there and sentenced to be caned. And we look at that as if it's barbaric.
Right.
But the barbarism of taking that same person for the same crime and putting them in a penitentiary, a box, right? Yeah. That's the trash being hidden away, because we're not looking at it. We think that's somehow better. But first of all, the physical pain and abuses and risks to life and limb in penitentiary is going to be a lot more serious than the very controlled.
Yeah, rape is huge in prisons. Like, I mean, it's gone down, but yeah, I know it's really interesting. It's like crime or discipline and punish, right? Yeah,
yeah.
That that has like really. I actually have a friend who's going to law school right now, and he's interested in criminal justice reform or prison reform anyways. And he kind of has the same idea. Like if people were able to just be physically, they could choose if you want to be physically harmed, you know, by the state publicly, then, or if you want to go to prison, that's your choice. And he makes the claim like, you know, it depending on the severity of the crime is depending on the severity of the punishment, and it's your choice. And he really thinks that if people had that choice, they would choose to be physically harmed in some way.
I think they would, and I think the court is out as to whether that would impact deterrence, recidivism, all those measures. But there's no doubt that prisons are basically boot camp for criminality. So putting somebody in prison looks on paper like it's going to do a much better job of turning somebody into a career criminal than a bit of physical punishment. The other thing is you could improve prisons, and there are places like Norway where prisons are focused on rehabilitation, and recidivism rates are very low. They have a very different country, very different history. They're much more homogenous. They're tiny compared to us. So it's apples and oranges. It's difficult to know how some of their implementation would work here. But I do think something is clearly wrong. We're putting too many people away, and we're not seeing the results we should be getting with that choice of punishment. And it's an extremely expensive one. And it's expensive to society in many ways. And I don't think people have opened their minds to really, really serious alternatives at this point. Politically, mass incarceration was a result of a kind of arms race where people would run for office and promise to get tougher on crime. And if tougher on crime just means increase what you already have, namely increase the number of years that offenders need to serve for the same crime, you end up with this situation.
Yeah.
And I think the right way to say you're going to be tough on crime is to say you're going to deliver a result that will actually reduce crime and make society better. And we know that prison is not the best solution if that's your goal.
Yeah, well, you know, I've been in trouble quite a bit in my life. And when I was like 15, I started getting into trafficking drugs, and I got arrested when I was 16, and I got a bunch of big charges, and I was only 16 years old. You know, I got a bunch of felonies and did some time and all that stuff. But I was only 16. And now looking back on it, like when I was 16, I had this whole like different mentality because I was a stupid kid, which is why this shouldn't be the way that we handle these situations. But I had this idea like no snitching, obviously. Like I was like, am I glitching on you or no?
No, you're good.
Okay, cool. So I was like no snitching, but the person who I was doing the crime with was actually older than I am. He was 30 at the time. And yeah, and so him and I were doing some pretty outrageous things like counterfeiting money and buying drugs and trafficking them. And when I got arrested, I like tipped him off and he fled the country. And yeah, so then I went to jail and I was being investigated by the Secret Service because of the counterfeiting. So like I ended up getting in a lot of trouble, and you know, I didn't want to snitch and all that stuff. So then the prosecutor and everybody went really hard on me, and I got a bunch of felonies. And as a kid, when you're 16 years old and you get felonies and you have to serve time and all this stuff, and like the time that you serve, or I served anyways, in juvenile detention, was like 23-hour lockup. So you're in, you know, you're in a box for 23 hours a day.
Nuts.
Yeah. And so
I mean, that is torture. Like that's just
it is. Yeah.
torture.
No, it totally is.
That's
And
used as a torture method.
The framing that I came out of that situation with totally sucks. I dropped out of high school. I started selling drugs more. Like I went on to do.
Plus you're a felon, so employment.
Right. It goes down. That's the thing is I didn't view myself as a normal person anymore. I viewed myself as a felon. It was like this whole framing that I viewed myself as, and I got more into selling drugs and trafficking drugs, and I like ended up doing more crazy stuff. And I don't want to get too far into it because nothing ever came from it, but it was a very long road, you know, and I got myself in very, very deep. And I ended up getting myself out of it because I came to the conclusion that I didn't want to like be separated from my wife eventually. And I just saw the inevitability of ending up doing life in prison. You know, I just saw that was inevitable. And so actually this is what got me into neuroscience, was starting to understand my way of thinking. And it changed my way of thinking, and I got out of all that. But like experiencing that, which was essentially 10 years of nonstop bad shit, you know, experiencing that and trying to reframe my mind to not think about that anymore, think like that anymore, view myself as this and change it to like this. But I really do think that it had a lot to do with starting out in the criminal justice system the way that I did. I mean, and I was like groomed, if you want to call it that, by somebody that was, you know, older than me. And that's how I got into it. So it's like this really weird thing. The thing I'm trying to say is, if going through all of that when I was 16, if they would have said, look, like, I don't know how they would do this, but if they would have said, look, you're only 16 years old, like you've been groomed by a bad guy, you know, who manipulated you. And that's the only reason you did this stuff. Like, how, you know, I mean, it's not like, I'm not trying to discount my credit to the situation or whatever, but 16 years old, you know, it's like, how does anybody think rationally at that age? And you know, so anyways, so yeah, I just think that it's really interesting. Like the criminal justice system is so flawed in this country, and it builds criminals, you know?
Yeah. Eric, I'm so glad you shared that. I mean, it's an amazing story, and it's to have the courage, because these things are so stigmatizing, to tell people about it, to talk about your experience, but also what you've learned from it, because it is something people need to hear. And you're the success case. You're the one who did manage to turn it around, but it's not that easy. And as you say, when talking about free will and all these kind of more philosophical, metaphysical issues, we don't have the reins of our life, and a lot of things that happen to us and a lot of things we do are really consequences of where we happen to be located in the world. And I think for a great many who are being incarcerated, who are being disenfranchised from the vote, who are being used as forced labor, who are being subjected to psychological torture, they're there for reasons that were outside of their control. And even if they made some bad choices, going through that is not conducive to making better choices. Mm-hmm. And that affects all of us badly. So I think hearing testimony from people who've been there is really important. One of the things that happens with stigmatization and all the class issues too surrounding incarceration and economic opportunities diminishing is voice is also lost. There's a kind of great silencing. So even people who have come to see, prison reform as an important political platform issue, people who talk about mass incarceration, a lot of those folks whose hearts are in the right place are also not in dialogue with folks who've been inside. So
right. That's what Foucault kind of talks about too.
Yeah.
And that's a huge, so that's kind of like actually one of the things that I'm really hoping, like I'm going to school now and I'm really hoping that I can get into like some kind of a teaching position eventually. It's going to take a really long time.
Yeah.
But it would be really cool to like kind of be able to explore the consequences of the way that we think about consciousness and free will and morality, because it has huge impacts on society and culture. And I mean, I know Sapolsky talks to us, I know that you talk about this as well, but it's really interesting how I actually got an email after our conversation last time from someone who was like, I just can't choose to believe that free will, it doesn't exist because I don't know how to discipline my kids. And I was like, well, okay, so just because you don't know how to handle that situation, does that make it not real?
Also, I mean, yeah, it's like the very concept of disciplining kids is a reminder that we are constantly shaping and warping behavior. I mean, the example I always use is if you look at how young kids behave, they're more or less psychopaths. Like this complete disregard for others. They'll hit you, they'll kick you, they'll bite you, they'll scratch you, they'll steal stuff, they'll lie flagrantly. And some of this is clinically related to medical or clinical psychopathy insofar as they have underdeveloped frontal lobes. Impulse control is harder for kids. But the truth is their conformity to our norms is not just a matter of brain development, because long before the frontal lobe is well developed, we get these monstrous little kids to be really well behaved some of the time. And we're shaping behavior, we're conditioning them. Morality isn't something we're born with, it's something that's beaten into us. Right. And whatever culture you happen to be in will beat a different morality into you. But it's a pretty effective process. So, long before adolescence, most kids are no longer stealing, no longer attacking each other at will. Maybe they're lying a bit, but they develop a conscience. And conscience is a kind of learned mechanism. It's, it's the warden within that we instill. So freedom of the will is, a misnomer. It's when you talk about people choosing the right thing instead of the wrong thing. The notion of choice there is pretty empty. You've basically implanted a view about what's right and wrong, and you've implanted a mechanism that allows, under a lot of circumstances, the ability to pick the right over the wrong. But picking is because of a well-oiled machine, not because of the spirit that takes control.
Yeah, so I wanted to talk to you a little bit about, well, oh man, there's so many things I want to talk to you about, but okay, let's dive into your book a little bit. Attention. Well, is that what it's called?
Oh, the conscious brain?
What? Yeah,
Conscious.
the conscious brain. Yeah, but let's talk about attention
Sure.
and kind of your hypothesis slash I would call it a theory, but um, talk about your perspective on consciousness and maybe explain to the audience a little bit just about kind of like what got you to that position, and then also can you talk about why you think that you're receiving some pushback and maybe I don't know. Alternative views, I guess.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, the phenomenon of consciousness is something that interests us, and we often talk about, the smell of coffee or the color red. But to study it, rather than waxing poetic about the contents of experience, we need to do something like contrast it with what it's not. What is the opposite of consciousness? What is its opposite? What is its alternative? Which is, of course, unconsciousness, being unconscious, doing something without awareness. And I think if we bring that home to day-to-day life, forgetting the lab, forgetting philosophy, we do a lot of things absent-mindedly, distractedly. We do a lot of things where something happens without our noticing it. Like if you have alerts on your computer that tell you if new email comes in, you'll see them much of the time. But if you're writing an email or doing anything else that requires your focus on the computer, the same alert that's occupying the same bit of your visual space may occur without you noticing it. If you've ever been pickpocketed, pickpockets are masters of this because if you go to a magic show, somebody, might distract you by waving an arm up in the air while using the other arm to take your wallet or to perform the magic trick. Those are cases where you're faced with something, it's in front of you, your eyes have total access to it, it's probably entering your brain, affecting your visual areas, yet you have no awareness of seeing it. It's something that's happened unconsciously. So consciousness and unconsciousness are constant features in day-to-day life. Right now, when you stare at a computer screen, there's actually a huge periphery. And your visual field, even though it's not very focused, is quite expansive. And if you had a different task, like let me scan the room to see if I can find where I placed that book or something, you're suddenly going to notice a kind of remarkable swelling of your experience. Vision is going to go from this focal window on your computer screen to the whole room around you. But nothing has changed. Your eyes were getting all that stuff the whole time. So to me, the starting place was just looking at these cases in ordinary life where our consciousness waxes and wanes and shrinks and expands. It turns out that there's a huge amount of science that does basically that in the laboratory. And the way it does it is not by waving a hand in the air like the magician, but by maybe creating a visual stimulus that's very distracting while you're performing another task. And if the visual stimulus is very distracting, you might briefly lose awareness of the task.
Is this, just to interrupt for a second, is this kind of like Daniel Kahneman's fast and slow thinking, or type 1, type 2? I haven't read his book in a long time.
It is potentially related. I mean, for Kahneman and other defenders of what's called dual process theory, the thought is that we have a very automatic system that is able to do things that are very complex often, but also very familiar. They're things we've done 1,000 times before, and they become automatic. And those things that don't require bringing new thought or resources to bear are very often things that we can do unconsciously. Things that are novel, things that are in some way demanding of reflection or consideration or choice, those things tend to be conscious. But there's another way in which it's a very different distinction, which is to say, some of these things that are part of like choice, they are things that are very demanding, can go in and out of consciousness just by the mere fact of distraction. Something that would normally be conscious can become unconscious. So one experimental paradigm shows somebody a computer screen, and they give somebody a little task to do, a visual task. Like if you see two intersecting lines, a crosshair, like a plus sign, but you vary the length of the line, so the horizontal is sometimes longer, and sometimes the vertical is longer. Simply keep showing people these plus signs and say, okay, is it the vertical that's longer now? Is it the horizontal that's longer? Is it the vertical that's longer? That's a task that we can perform pretty easily, but to perform it, we need to focus on that plus sign. If you flash a word or a face or a polygon, like a triangle, while somebody is performing that task, most people in certain conditions will not see the triangle, they will not see the face, they will not see the word. But if you give them a different task or no task and present that word or that triangle, 100% see it. So the very same thing that's normally extremely visible, it's right in the middle of your visual field, it's like in the center of the screen, can be sort of magically, and this is how magicians work, magically turned invisible. So it's not so much that with the Kahneman thing, you have certain things that we always do automatically, certain things that we always do effortfully. In this case, the very same thing can sort of flip in and out of consciousness by this manipulation. So the experiments have accumulated a lot of evidence that are a bit of common sense, that consciousness comes and goes with attention, is demonstrably true. When you're attending to something, you experience it. When you're not attending to it, because you're distracted by some other task, it disappears. So the very simple idea that emerges from this, I think, daily observation is consciousness is attention. This morning I was letting an espresso run in my crappy old espresso machine and making orange juice at the same time. And of course the espresso overran, and it wasn't because I had positioned them next to each other so I could actually like immediately stop and make the coffee flow end. They were both in front of me. Each one was equally present in my visual field, but the coffee ran over because I was focused on the orange. So this is like part of our constant experience in day-to-day life. The scientific theory that consciousness is attention, that attention is a kind of gatekeeper that turns consciousness on and off, is, I think, something that has an enormous amount of support from the sciences, from psychology, but also from neuroscience. You can look at the brain areas involved in consciousness in one study, look at the brain areas involved in attention in another study, and you'll find basically perfect overlap. So I came to believe that this is, though it's extremely simple and extremely intuitive, just the right view of how consciousness arises in the mind and brain. You asked about other theories. There are other theories, and there are detractors. In neuroscience, one theory of consciousness right now that's gained some momentum has to do with what's called information integration. So a neuroscientist named Tononi has argued that consciousness arises when populations of neurons speak to each other, basically. So the more communication you get across neurons, the more consciousness you should have on that theory.
But isn't that attention essentially? I mean,
so there are two. Yeah.
Why? If neurons are talking to each other, it's because it's trying to perform a task. Yeah. But I mean, okay. Sorry. So I'm gonna let you talk. But
no, that was great. I think that's exactly. I think that's exactly the right reply. You can make the reply in two stages if you're trying to compare these theories. Suppose the view is that consciousness arises with information integration, but the information you're integrating is like getting perception into a place where you can think about it, reflect on it, use it.
Okay. And so just really fast question about this before I forget, because I didn't write it down. But okay, so let's just say that you broke your arm, and at the same time you are having light flashed at you or something, right? Like, do you think, I'm just curious, I know that you're going to continue talking about this, but do you think that like your conscious awareness in that moment would be focused on the broken arm, the light, or the fact that there's something fucking crazy going on?
Great. Yeah, I mean, of course, a lot of the research on this is all about creating competition between two things that are placing demands on your attention. And a pain and a bright light are both very, very powerful attentional lures. If nothing else is going on, the pain will get your attention and the flashing light will get your attention. If they're both going on, that's called a dual task situation, where you have two things that are now competing for your attention. And there's a lot of science that goes into figuring out which one you attend to if either. So you had a third possibility, which is suddenly you go kind of meta and the task itself becomes something like, what the fuck is going on here? And of course, all those things can happen. And like, you might think the pain will always grab our attention. But I mean, I think a lot of us have had the experience of, say, having a really bad headache and trying to treat it by just watching crappy television, or, do something else that consumes your attention. And you can literally distract yourself away from the pain. And likewise, a lot of us have had the experience of trying to do something like watch television, but we have a really bad pain that makes it hard to focus on the TV because the pain is occupying you. So it's kind of, you can think of it as like hydraulic, just these two forces that are working on you. And depending on the number of factors, one can win that competition. And in some cases, neither wins. You just end up dividing your attention and kind of focusing on both. Attention can spread. We tend to think about attention as this very focal thing. Like some people equate attention with selection, but I think that's not right. Selection is something that we can do with attention and something that happens within attention. But normally we're also attending, I call it ambient attention. We're attending to sort of a surrounding area that's not the main thing we're focusing on. So attention can have this diffusion that spreads to things that are of possible interest but aren't really the key focus. And then it can have points of focus that are the main locus of interest at that time. So I think in the flashing light case, you might get moments where your pain shifts into that kind of ambient periphery, and the flashing light becomes the focal object, and then it can switch back and forth that way. But with such intense stimuli, it's probably unlikely that you could achieve points where you're totally unaware of either. But let's just on information integration, come back to the reply you made before, which I think the right one. I think it's one of two replies that are both necessary to sort of deflect that competing view. And one reply is the one you made, which is, this just is attention. And I think that's entirely right. If you look at what attention does, if you look at how attention operates in the brain, basically attention is about information flow. When you attend to something, information is able to flow, and stuff that was merely sensory can become cognitive. Things that were just part of your visual experience can now be objects of thought, of reflection, of problem solving, reasoning. They can access language centers so you can describe them or report on them. If you present a visual stimulus without attention, it might affect processing in some way, but people can't report on it, they can't name it, they can't make a decision about it. So attention is really about information integration. On the other hand, there are cases where you have a very narrow channel of attention where you don't get that much information integration. If you're doing a very monotonous task where you just need to focus on one thing, maybe even in a kind of meditative state, you should try and get yourself into a good state of mental health. You've just decided you're gonna do this very monotonous thing and think about just that. There, information integration dissipates, but consciousness may remain quite high. Even in the case of flow, like a musician who's so absorbed in her task of, say, playing the piano, that is not a case of tremendous information integration. The musical, task is quite challenging and might involve, coordinating muscles and coordinating sound. But language might be turned off, vision might even be attenuated, free reflection, like cognitive elaboration, all of that is off the table at that moment because the musician is so focused on this task. So that's a case of high consciousness but low integration. And the other kind of counterexample is a case of high integration and low consciousness. And there's a lot of evidence that among the tasks that we do best unconsciously are the ones that require multiple channels of information. So very complex pattern recognition, for instance, even something like language processing. We're totally unaware of the rules of language. If somebody said, how did you process that sentence? How did you know like what the underlying structure was that made you able to understand what somebody is saying? We're very, very bad at giving voice to that. We do that unconsciously. But language processing is an incredibly integrative task. It's bringing semantic information, information about sound, and information about structure, and knowledge of a specific linguistic symbol system, communicative intentions. All of that stuff has to be brought to bear on that task, but most of that goes on unconsciously. So I don't think there's a very direct correlation between the amount of stuff that's being integrated and the amount of consciousness. What matters for consciousness is whether stuff can flow forward. And that's what you're talking about. Attention allows that kind of integration, information getting from one place to another. It's not the total amount of information that matters.
Yeah, also, I mean, like, what about parts of the brain where we're kind of unconscious about it happening, but there's still neurons talking to each other, like the lizard parts of the brain, like exactly. Things that handle the autonomous systems, I guess.
It turns out the cerebellum is incredibly active during all kinds of cognitive tasks.
Yeah.
But we don't find consciousness there.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, no, yours makes the most sense to me. And I've read a lot of books on consciousness, I mean, I know that I'm not like a professor, I'm not a researcher or anything like that. So it's kind of like, take it for what it is. But it just, I have ever since I started reading your book, I've been trying to do like little like things with myself, I guess, and like just think about things, and it kind of basically, like, I feel like it leads into this my next question, but it leads into this thing of, if we're trying to really participate in life and enjoy life, we should be focusing on it in a way. We should give it our attention. And people like Sam Harris, who, he's written a book on waking up or whatever. And the, people that like focus on meditation and try to find ways to really get you to feel yourself, be present, be there, have your attention focused on your breath, I don't know. It's interesting. It's almost like everybody's trying to figure this out, and it's right in front of them.
I love that synopsis, because I do think, for me writing the book, it wasn't about, I'm going to come up with a theory.
Right.
Much less, I have a theory and I want to prove that it's right and everyone else is wrong. I really came to it with an open mind. I wanted to know, what does common sense say? What does lived experience say? And what does science say? So I took myself almost to just be reporting what I took to be obvious, and then doing some science journalism and saying, what does the science show? What's the best theory given all of the experimental work that's been done on this question? So for me, it wasn't really, I never thought of it as my theory. I thought of it as, this is just what we've learned. This is obvious from life, but turns out also well supported by science, and it shouldn't come as a surprise to anyone. It's not a deep insight. It's not a theory that says, wow, I never would have thought of that. It's like a theory you want to hear and say, oh yeah, I knew that. And what I like so much about your question is then what's not written in the book is why this matters and what this can teach us about life. I mean, when I wrote that book, and it is a dense book, I think, and this is sort of a problem with consciousness studies in general, I got so caught up in, let me think about the underlying mechanism and not, why is this problem even interesting? And from a certain perspective, the problem of consciousness is really uninteresting because minds can do so much without consciousness that consciousness seems to be, some people even say it makes no difference whatsoever whether you're conscious or not. Everything we can do consciously, we can also do unconsciously, so who cares about consciousness? But you asked a question that makes it clear why consciousness matters to us. And it matters to us because the things we do unconsciously are just not part of what a life worth living contains. Those things are not part of us. They're not part of our lives. The unconscious, in a way, is almost as if, you know, some robotic system of external control has taken over our bodies and made us do things. But it's not our lived life. So if consciousness is all we have, if consciousness is the location of the life that we can call our own, then it's really important that we use it well. And you mentioned this idea of, you know, focusing on the present. You know, I've sipped my coffee, you know, 20, 30 times since we started this conversation. I didn't taste it any one of those times, much less enjoy it. You know, it was a completely habitual act. Right. And every failure to have experienced my coffee was missing out on a pleasure I could have had. And as we've talked about in other conversations, you know, pleasure is just, you know, one small aspect of experience. But if you can have a life that's full of experiences of all kinds, both the enjoyable ones and even some of the negative ones, that's a full life. If you have a life where you put everything on autopilot, as we often do when we're stressed and focusing on the next task, those are points in your life that you miss. I resent sleep. Like, I feel like I'm an insomniac, and
me and you both. Oh my God, my wife. You have no. I lived most of my life with this whole idea of like sleep is a waste of time, you know, and it's really unfortunate because I'm pretty sure my brain has taken huge hits because of that. But anyways.
I know people who dream well, you know, who can wait for it. That's fine. That's a good use of sleep. But if you're not remembering your dreams are just boring or stressful, you know, sleep is lost time. And it's not that we need to be productive or fill our hours with something useful, but filling our hours with experiences that we can, you know, really, really savor and reflect on. I think that's what life is all about. But the truth is, all of us are dreaming half the time while waking. Right. And hours will go by and you will have no memory of what happened because you were probably like a walking zombie during a lot of that time. So I do think if we think about consciousness as our gift, that's where biographical life resides, and everything else is being a zombie or being a robot, then it does incentivize us to fill those moments well, to savor things. And I think, you know, the duration of life is not measured in the number of years. It's kind of measured in the units of consciousness. And forgetting that can put us in a position where decades can pass and you can step back and say, where was I in all that?
Yeah, that's interesting. You know, because it's like if you're gonna live to be 100, but your life is fucking boring, then what is the point? And I have lived a pretty insane life. Like, I've done a lot of crazy shit, and I'm at the point now where I'm like really trying to step back from that. But it's interesting because most of my life I lived in this frame of mind that was very much, I mean, I didn't understand neuroscience or behavioral biology or biology in general, but I always like lived this life that was kind of like, if I live a full life until I'm 30, I'm happy. But now I'm 30, you know, and it's like, I don't know, it's interesting because I really did, like, my wife and I have been together for 10 years ish, and her and I, we've been through a lot together. She has stood by me through some crazy experiences, and that was kind of like how I always live my life, though. I'm like, fuck it, like, I want to like not work a 9 to 5. I was like totally against that for a very long time. I want to not work a 9 to 5. I want to experience as much as I can, travel as much as I can, you know, party and dance and do whatever as much as I can. And then it kind of all caught up to me, and I like started to feel this weird fear, you know, which is really, it's a really strange thing, because I was just like, holy shit, like I've been living on the edge for so long. I'm gonna go over eventually. And I think it was around, I was 26, so it's like right after. I don't know if there's any correlation between the brain maturing or not, but
Yeah.
I don't know. It's really interesting. I just what's interesting about it is that I still struggle very, very hard with 9 to 5 stuff.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, it's like I get done at the end of the day, and I'm really lucky because I have a job where I can like listen to books on tape or, you know, Audible or whatever, and I can do Great Courses Plus during the day, like listen to Great Courses Plus. But it's just at the end of the day, I'm like, okay, what am I doing? You know.
9 to 5 is hard. I mean, that's the other thing. It's easy to say, oh, let's fill life with good experiences or interesting experiences. But the reality is, you know, we all have to pay the rent, and the majority of jobs out there for people who are lucky enough to even have jobs are mundane, are monotonous, are not rewarding, are not stimulating. So I think a much more realistic way to think about the challenge of consciousness is, you know, given that we have all these things bearing on us, all these responsibilities, how do we within that, you know, find space for ourselves, find space for growth? I think you kind of have done this in such a you know, remarkably successful way, because despite having all those things in your life, you've also chosen to use your spare time to learn, to grow, and to share with others. Eric, before you mentioned, you know, you want to teach and it's going to take a long time before you get there. Bullshit. You're there already. You're all of this is teaching. You are a teacher, and yeah, it is going to be a, you know, possibility in the future, and won't take forever to get in a classroom or another teaching environment if you want that. But you know, you've shown all of us that you don't need any kind of degree or, you know, employment in an educational institution to share knowledge. And your decision to do that is, I think, a great model for how, given all the constraints on life, we can still use our time well.
Well, that's very nice of you. I appreciate it. So do you think the best way to like experience consciousness is through things like meditation, or what? I mean, what do you think the best way to like actually experience life and not let it pass you by would be? Or do you think that that's okay if it does? I mean,
yeah, I definitely think it's okay if it does. I also think it's okay if it's not filled with, you know, peak experiences or learning. You mentioned sort of 100 years is insignificant if it's boring, but even boredom is something we can, you know, allow ourselves or enjoy. There is something to the idea of savoring experience, of thinking about experience as something that has intrinsic worth. It's not always instrumental.
mm-hmm. Yeah, just to mention, like, that was kind of the way I used to think. I don't really think that way anymore. I've changed my perspective on that quite a bit. You know, like, I now value my peaceful time. I used to think that it had to be full of crazy experiences in order to live life or whatever, but I don't really think that anymore.
There's a kind of paradox of boredom. This comes up in some philosophical work on aesthetics, which is like some artists have tried to create boring art just because they're always trying to create new, interesting experiences. So, you know, playwrights make things that are tragic or scary or suspenseful or amusing or sexually arousing. Like, art is all about inducing different emotions, but boredom is just another emotion. So why not intentionally create boring art? And the paradox of the puzzle arises because if you do that successfully, that's kind of interesting.
Right.
So a famous example of this, Andy Warhol created a film that's 8 hours long, and it's just footage of the Empire State Building in New York at night. Now, the building is illuminated so you can see it, but nothing happens. Like there's no activity, there's no street scene, lights don't go on and off. The luminance remains relatively constant because it's just the 8-hour night span. So, I mean, I once sat through 2 hours of this. Like it is a kind of meditative activity, but it's more like an endurance test. Can you do this? But I found while watching that, I became fascinated with subtlety, with small differences. I became reflective on my own experience and thought, what is this experience? What is the phenomenology of boredom? What am I experiencing? And boredom is a really fascinating phenomenology because it's not a single uniform state. Sometimes it's like this kind of nervous energy, like I want to get out of here. You're feeling trapped. You're feeling, and
you have to deal with your thoughts, and those can be scary sometimes because you might start thinking about bad things that you've done to others or something. I don't know.
No doubt, putting yourself in a situation where you're just staring at something for hours, your mind goes all kinds of places that you don't necessarily want to go. But that itself becomes kind of fascinating. So I do think, there's no experience that isn't potentially of interest. And part of what we can do, like by thinking about consciousness, is just develop a sensitivity to that very fact. Meditation is just one way to do this. And there are many, many different forms of meditation. Some forms of meditation are about kind of clearing the mind. A lot of them are about kind of removing yourself from the agentic self, the self that's the doer, that says, I have this and that to do, I have this agenda. And it creates a kind of radical passivity where you're just receiving information. But other forms of meditation aren't like that. And I think, for me anyway, the main thing isn't so much that here's the exercise that you should do to make best use of your consciousness. It's kind of fundamentally the opposite of that. It's that we shouldn't think that there's any single thing to do, because the best use of our consciousness is just to do a lot of different stuff. And that doesn't mean find as many exciting activities to keep doing things that are incredibly novel. Different stuff may be different ways of being bored, different ways of doing nothing, different ways of wasting time, different, opportunities to watch the grass grow. And philosophers sometimes use as a kind of example when they're talking about worthless activities, the example of just choosing to watch the grass grow. And I think maybe a life of just doing that, like a life of just doing anything, would be redundant to a point that the span of years would collapse into a single moment. Each one would just be kind of holographically reflecting the same activity. But watching the grass grow for a day or a week or even a year, why not?
Yeah.
Somebody says, this is, somebody who has a trust fund has to do this, but somebody who can pay their rent without worry could say, this year I'm just going to, sit outside for hours each day and watch the difference in the way light hits the field. Keep track of a single blade of grass and watch, the way we might nurture a pet or a child. Each day I'm going to see how that blade of grass is doing and has it grown, withered. Why not? So I think there's an open-ended range of allocations of consciousness, and the main thing is just to realize that experience is our one commodity and make them, count.
Yeah, it's hard for me to do anything for long periods of time. I've noticed it's an unfortunate thing for me because I mean, like sitting at home is something that I think a lot of people are learning how to do right now. I'm not, because I have a lot more work than normal right now. But it's interesting, like the days that I am sitting at home, sometimes I'll start to like panic that I'm not doing enough. And then I'll like have to reflect on that a little bit, So
I think one of the things that's going to come out of quarantine, life, this global lockdown, is priorities are going to change. My work schedule has remained also pretty intense and pretty constant. But it's, different working from home. But I think what a lot of people are finding is that they're doing stuff with their time that they haven't done before. And when we're all told we need to go back to the office, you're going to be people who have been totally content with that, maybe even really loved it, and almost, people who are very careerist and focused on success and achievement, will suddenly find, and maybe in a way that's at first quite depressing or disorienting, that they can't do it anymore. They can't do it that way anymore. And that's a pretty seismic shift in how we think about our lives. And if this is all, going on pretty globally, and the general consensus is this, kind of extreme investment of time and energy into work life is no longer tolerable anymore.
I have this like weird, I don't know if it's a theory or what, but I have this idea that after people get done with this, they're going to demand paid time off from either their employers or the government. I think the government should pay for it personally, but I think that the government should fund 2 weeks paid vacation out of tax dollars, because why not?
I think the government is going to have to do that eventually. In fact, I think there's going to have to eventually be a universal standard income, on pain of total societal collapse. Because, as machines take over our jobs, there are going to be a lot of people who, just can't work anymore, but still need to live. And that's going to lead to, crime and unrest unless those people are given the bare resources that they need. So I think we could, on a rosy picture of technology, we could get to a point where everyone works far fewer hours because we have machines doing a lot of the tasks that we used to do. And
that was kind of the goal of industrial revolution that never happened. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. The problem is, and the reason why I'm sort of pessimistic about the future with respect to this aspect of technology is right now society isn't set up to handle that, because who's going to pay for the universal standard income? And the answer is, well, of course the government is, but where do they get their money? They get their money from taxes. But if you have mass unemployment, the tax revenue drops off precipitously as well. So the government coffers will be empty, and you'll have all these people who can't eat, and somebody's going to have to pay for that unless we go into, a kind of Hobbesian war of all against all. So my guess is the tech companies are going to have to come to the plate at that point, that the ones who have the money are going to be the creators of these technologies.
Oh yeah, I think we talked about this in the last podcast, actually. Yeah, totally. Can I throw a pessimistic idea that I have towards you?
Yeah.
I think the opposite's going to end up happening.
All right.
I think that what's going to end up happening after this quarantine is we're going to see a lot more nationalism. I think we're going to see a lot more racism, and people wanting more like nationalistic policies. I mean, this is me being super pessimistic, but I basically see 2 options moving forward. I see the creation of some kind of global government, like a new world order, the conspiracies would call it. I would call it something good, but or nationalism in a way that Trump is already kind of inciting, and closing the borders. And we're already closing borders to each other because of this quarantine. And we're already trying to find inward solutions because of the quarantine. Like we're saying, okay, like, why does China make all the masks? Why does China do all this for us? Maybe we need to do all of this stuff. And I see this as an opportunity for 2 things. Either they're going to go globalistic or they're going to go nationalistic.
Yeah.
And my concern is that this is like paving a road to nationalism. And I think there's a lot of countries that are like maybe wanting this anyways. It's not like this hasn't been in the forefront of discussion for the last, 4 years or whatever. So
I can definitely see that. I mean, we're already in a moment in history where nationalism has been on the rise again. And there's no doubt that the Trump administration has capitalized on people's belief that American policy should preferentially protect Americans, even if that means, trade policies that exclude the world, if it means removal from treaties that protect the planet, if it means
building a wall.
Yeah, building a wall. It is hard to say. My guess is that there's not going to be a single pattern. It's going to give rise to sort of different solutions. Global quarantine. Some people are going to take that route and say we need to isolate. When Trump called this the Chinese virus,
over and over and over again.
Yeah. So what he was signaling is that what we need to do in the future is immediately cut the borders. The problem is cutting borders, in addition to the ethics of all that, is at odds with another goal of his, which is to build the economy. Mm-hmm. So isolationism in a world that's increasingly global economically is not a viable solution. So how do you balance being a major power on the international playing field, having exports that people want, being involved in trade partnerships that lead to strengthening of your own economy, while also being isolationist? And that's the answer is those are not compatible goals. And I think others will sort of see this as a great equalizer, that it brought the world together. We're all in this together. That the futility of blocking borders has been demonstrated, that even with restrictions, the pandemic has advanced and crossed borders. So for those people thinking about working together globally to deal with these crises in the future, to having an international plan instead of each little
that makes the most sense to me. Like,
yeah.
Why didn't we spend, instead of retroactively spending $6 trillion on trying to like boost the economy or whatever, why didn't we take a preemptive strategy and try to, like, as a globe, make better agricultural institutions?
Exactly. I mean, there are things we could have done for the future, but even for the virus, at a much smaller expense, we could have done what South Korea did, which was really extensive testing. Mm-hmm. Right now we're finding out that lots of people are asymptomatic,
right,
and still spread the virus, and that's probably why it's spread so easily.
Yeah, but it's evolution.
The ideal solution is you test everyone,
right,
immediately. Like right away. People in South Korea, they were doing thousands of tests a day and getting results within 2 to 6 hours, 24 hours max. We still can't do that in America. And
yeah, they have like 180,000 tests waiting around right now that haven't been tested yet.
If not, so if they had tested when we still had numbers in the dozens, if they had tested really broadly at that time, and all those people who were positive, whether symptomatic or not, were told you really got to isolate, we probably could have done a lot to nip this in the bud. But who knows? I think there's going to be a lot of 2020 hindsight. We all think that there was an optimal solution. There are probably better and worse ones. It's a big, natural experiment where we're going to compare the countries that had better outcomes from the countries that had worse. But the bottom line is we're dealing with, a virus, which is this,
invisible enemy,
airborne thing that can, float around for hours, and no policy can prevent that from doing some harm. Just some can do better and worse. I think the best thing that's going to come out from it is, a little vacation for the environment.
Seriously.
What I'd like to see come out of it are better policies for protecting the most vulnerable. So
me too.
All the people who are out of work and, not able to survive at this point, those folks need help. They need governments to sort of step up and support them. And I don't think there's much movement right now in the current administration towards that. The problem with a bailout is you give, first of all, it's not going to individuals, but even if it's individuals, they spend that money on 1 month's food and rent.
Mm-hmm.
and they'd still be unemployed and unable to.
Are they going to do it? What are they going to do? Just do $6 trillion every couple of weeks or something, or 3 trillion or 2 trillion, whatever it is. It's like, I mean, I don't know. I don't want to get too far away from your book and stuff like that, or consciousness, I guess. But unless you want to talk about this, because this is something I'm very passionate about.
No, I'm happy to go anyway. But I do, I do think this is a dress rehearsal for mass unemployment. I think if we have this experience and can figure out what to do with respect to the economic implications, we'll be in a much better position to deal with really radical shifts in the economy that are inevitable. On the other hand, if we don't figure it out, we're in for some pretty tough times ahead.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good opportunity, because I just think that the right person, the right leader, could really take advantage of this, and the right businesses are going to really take advantage of this as well, and say like, okay, look, we don't need all of these offices that are a huge waste of space. People can work from home now, and we can pay them more money to use their space, and it'll cost us less money to have buildings, you know?
Yeah.
Same thing with, I mean, governments, like, you know, this idea that coronavirus is somehow this one-off situation, you know, where people need help. Like if someone gets cancer and they don't have health insurance, they need help. It's their life is coming to a halt, not their economy is coming to a halt, not, you know, maybe not the countries, but they're, you know, and so the government could really take advantage of this. And I mean, the people could too. The people could demand change. I mean, I don't see why they wouldn't.
Won't do it. The employers won't do it. They're going to say this has been a great education and which positions are unnecessary. They're going to find better ways to exploit. They're going to cut back on the number of employees and on the expenditure for employees. Yeah. And they're going to profit, but the worker, you know, is going to lose. And so it's never going to come from on high. We're always going to have to fight for it. I mean, Joe Biden, who's the probable nominee of the Democratic Party, first of all, has been absolutely invisible in this. Yeah, his comments on his own website on COVID have been really generic and no sign of imagination or leadership or kind of effort to make an impact. But also his plan for healthcare leaves a million Americans uninsured. And those who aren't, and that's on the best estimate, the most rosy picture estimate, because his insurance premiums remain high enough that many who could be insured will just opt not to be insured because they'd rather not spend that money. So we'll still have enormous numbers who are uninsured. And in a situation like this, or all the usual health crises that occur in a human life, wealth and poor will still dictate life expectancy as they always have. So I don't see any figure on the horizon who's going to make this happen right now.
Yang was kind of a hopeful candidate, but it was like he was so obscure that nobody really wanted to take advantage of it. And
I like Yang. I mean, I do think he's a good example of somebody. The advantage, we have this folk hero idea of coming from outside the Beltway. Americans love people who are from outside of Washington. And in general, I think that's not a particularly good formula for picking good leaders. It means
clearly
quality and experience. And especially when we go to these folks and people who have no credentials, no political expertise, nothing. It's a recipe for disaster. But the one advantage of going outside of Washington is when we pick somebody who has an expertise in something else that could really be of value in policy. And I think he was a good example of that. And I think of all the candidates, he was by far the most forward-thinking. He's somebody whose views were really about where we're going economically, not where we currently are.
Yeah, so it's interesting. I after reading Discipline and Punish, is it Punishment or Punish?
Punish, yeah.
I think this is the third
verb. Like to discipline is a verb and to punish is a verb.
Okay, cool. Yeah. So I was so, it was interesting thinking about that. And then thinking about Yuval Noah Harari, if that's how you say his name, and thinking about just like our conversation and stuff, because I've been thinking a lot about like a pathway forward. And, you know, Yuval is kind of like a pessimist as well, and he can join our train, and or my train at least.
Yeah, yeah.
and and he was talking, I was listening to something that he was talking about with regards to this. Actually, it was kind of recent because we had talked about him and he had been on my mind, so I kind of looked at some of the stuff that he was saying about the coronavirus. And one of the things that he was saying that I found interesting, I don't necessarily know if I agree with or not, but was that this is going to unleash like the genie of government surveillance to a level that we've never seen before, and it's not going to go back.
Yeah.
And the reason why I wanted to bring this up with regards to discipline and punish is because he talks about China, and you know, let's not even say China, let's say he talks about I don't know, unicorn land, and how if unicorn land could get surveillance enacted where they can monitor your body temperature, then increase the tech a little bit so that they could monitor like what your brain activity is kind of doing and how you make decisions, and then just track that throughout your life so that they know when you get really sick and they can quarantine you. I mean, this is super dystopian thinking, but yeah. He brings up the idea that the scary part about this is that he thinks that the tech is around the corner for something like this, and you know, it could literally be inserted at birth, and then your life could be tracked, and then when you go for your first interview they look at like some download of you know, like everything that you've done and whether or not you're a good candidate for the job. Yeah. And I was wondering kind of what you thought about that. Like it seems a little like, you know, 1984-ish, but what do you think?
I think that's very realistic. I mean,
yeah.
You know, Foucault's an interesting case because he really recognized that our method of norm enforcement of you know, societal control has shifted to a surveillance model. There used to be a centralized state, a king who could show the might of the state by very publicly exerting physical power. But once we become the state, once society is democratized, once power spreads and you no longer have this monarch who's trying to, in a very showy way, establish just how mighty he is, the question of control has to get radically distributed too. And Foucault recognized that surveillance is the vehicle that allows that. So he thinks that with the birth of the human sciences, we're not just sort of getting better ways to understand human behavior, that knowledge is intimately linked to power. The more we know about human behavior, the more we're able to use that knowledge as a form of social control. He died of AIDS, and he died before the age of mass incarceration. He died before the age of the internet. He died before, you know, London was covered with
so crazy to think about that too.
Yeah, I mean, he saw forward.
Saw all of it, yeah. Same with Marx. Marx and him, I actually, I don't know if you've read much of Marx, but him and Marx, to me, like when I read Foucault and I've read Marx as well, I was just like, wow, both of these guys are so ahead of their time. It's not even fathomable. Like, how did they know? You know, but anyway, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, absolutely. I do think they were remarkably prescient. And I think right now we're at the tip of the iceberg. I mean, you see a lot of people who sound almost paranoid or conspiratorial talking about, you know, Google or other big tech companies collecting our search data. I don't think that's paranoia at all. I think, you know, the internet is a baby. It's brand new. I mean, most of us who are online lived through its you know, birth. So where we're going to be with this in 10, 20 years, you know, boggles the mind. And all the stuff we've been doing now, today, at a point where the technology is still fairly limited, is stored. It's all out there.
And also, I mean, like, look at how Google can shape your purchasing decisions. It can shape the news that you get. It can literally change the course of your life without you even knowing it. I mean, the Russian Twitter bots or whatever is a prime example of that. Like, they were able to sway an election. And I mean, that might be a conspiracy or whatever, but they did. And they did it by the hand trick that we were talking about earlier, like keeping people interested in something and spreading information and directing people towards what their thoughts were.
Absolutely. And we don't even need subterfuge in that case, because Trump had one simple and continues to have one simple formula, which is stay in the headlines. Right. And he has one simple way of doing that, which is offend people.
Yeah.
So that every time he says something that offends liberal sensibilities, he's guaranteed a headline.
Yeah.
And every time we know, because we live in an internet-obsessed information age, we know that airtime equals power. So, and we know this from basic psychology too, the more somebody, it's a kind of celebrity effect, the more you see somebody's face, the more support they get, the more trust, the more love, the more people, want to see them. I think even liberals love him in a certain way, because
I did.
People can't stop talking about this guy.
And,
and we're all suckers, because all these tweets that are meant so obviously to just annoy liberal sensibilities have no news value. They're consequential, but they put him in the news, and that secures his power.
You look at him compared to John Kasich. I don't know if you followed the elections. Yeah. John Kasich versus Trump on the stage. Like, John Kasich, I don't agree with his policies or anything, but at least he was rational and he was sensible. And you could listen to John Kasich talk and like make points. And he would like make these like really good points about abortion and things like that were actually humane. And then Trump would just say, this guy's fucking hair sucks. Look at his hair. And then all of a sudden, headlines and people would cheer, and he would say things and then detract them the next week, because I don't really know if I believe that, and it's a game, and
it's a total game.
Yeah,
people used to comment at how he, there were these fact checkers that he would say something outrageously false, but now it's just expected.
Yeah,
but it's intentional, and I think so. We don't need to even go to the Russian bots, which I do think are a real thing and have real impact. We can just talk about how somebody knows that in an information age, staying in the headlines, using Twitter to offend people is a formula for mind control. It's a formula for celebrity based on nothing relevant to the actual job description. It's celebrity for celebrity's sake, but that in a democratic society is the most valuable resource, because when it comes down to it, the vote is a popularity contest.
I wish Bernie Sanders would just be like, my wife is hotter than your wife, Trump, or something like that.
The Democrats have nominated in my lifetime Walter Mondale, Dukakis, Kerry, Gore, even Hillary Clinton. These are very unimpressive people. They're not charismatic. They're not dynamic. They're not exciting. They're not provocative. They're not imaginative. They're not celebrities. None of them could ever host a reality show. And I don't mean that we need to capitulate to, politics as entertainment, but verve, even in the classroom, if you can't run a YouTube channel and get subscribers, that's a sign you probably couldn't run successfully for office, because it is that. It's about getting people to listen to you. And the truth is that policy change, doing something, making a difference, requires charisma. And if you look at, this is a simplification, but if you look at the kind of leaders who we now remember as great reformers, whether it's Martin Luther or Martin Luther King, these are people who had tremendous amount of verve. And I don't think that's a valence thing. You can be a villain and become powerful. You can be a saint and become powerful. The common denominator is this ability to capture our attention. Maybe it's consciousness again.
Oh, dude. Who Trump reminds me of is Mussolini. Mussolini was kind of like, just kind of like
he was smart.
He wasn't smart. He just had this like, hey, I'm the fucking guy, like this attitude, and he was able to lead people into fascism and But
People loved him. There's
yeah.
one formula that I think will always determine who has a chance of getting elected. And the question, and maybe we talked about this last time, but would you wear the T-shirt? And people fucking love those "Make America Great Again" caps.
Like a 30-cent hat.
And they want the Trump T-shirt. Trump is a brand. He's always been a brand. That's his main thing. He branded himself from the very beginning.
And he's
no one would wear a Biden T-shirt. No one would feel cool because they have Biden emblazoned across their chest, or have a Biden hat, a Biden bumper sticker. People thought they got cachet from Obama. Like I think the presidents who have won, or the Kennedys, they were figures for whom their supporters felt a kind of pride. They felt they looked better for liking this particular politician. And the Trump people feel they're lifted up by their advocacy of this guy.
I really like Sanders, and I feel like Sanders has that, like,
He's the only one who in this cohort who had that.
Yeah, and it's really unfortunate because he's like always working against tons of things. It's not just like working against the opinion of the American people, but it's working against, I hate to sound like a conspiracy theorist, but it's working against the media. And that's obvious, like you watch the debates and the media will spend 10 minutes before they're talking about everybody else. And Bernie Sanders could be like the guy that won the debate or won the primaries or something. And they don't even it's like he's out of the purview, And
it's weird. I mean, that part of course is unsurprising, since all the news media are owned by but his success in a way has been really surprising to me. Like in previous elections, I'm a good deal older, and there've always been candidates who are further to the left. Like for years it was Kusnik, who ran on a very similar platform to Sanders. And both of them were people with deep but relatively undistinguished congressional records, didn't have a lot of bills in their name, but really seemed to be speaking truth to power. They were, progressive liberals instead of centrists. But he always just looked like a kind of, not quite comedy relief, but there was something pathetic. Mm-hmm. Like this guy who, after all the serious candidates said their bit, he would say, come on, you guys, you're just controlled by the man, basically. People would kind of like humor him. Like it never felt like he never got any momentum at all. And Sanders rolls out, and he's not charismatic in the way we were talking about, at least not obviously so.
I think he's pretty funny. I think
he's funny, but he doesn't have the look. He doesn't turn a phrase in a way that's particularly inventive. He's not even really a provocateur. It's pretty much, you read, what he says, and it's, pretty standard. It's like watered down Noam Chomsky. It's nothing, particularly new with respect to ideas about how to run a country. But somehow he caught fire. The last cycle especially, I think he touched something. I think for young people especially, America was sort of entering a progressive moment. And I think for people of my generation who lived through a lot of time where there was a lot of open, acceptable, like hate and bias, where you could, use words for homosexuality pejoratively, where nobody cared about pronouns, where having a person of color on TV meant that they were the black character or the black family. Like there were so many ways in which, we were still living in a very overtly and openly bigoted world. And I think for people, in the kind of millennial cohort and younger, that didn't fly so much. People in my generation can still be sort of cavalier in talking about the environment, but I think for younger people who are going to sort of see foreseeable parts of their actual lifespan living in a world that's been, seriously damaged by our activities, caring about the environment seems really like a pretty real and important thing. So
that's something like not to get off that, but that's another thing that I wish Steven Pinker like would address that. But anyways,
yeah, if you measure progress by looking at homicide rates, we're doing great. You know,
yeah,
if you measure, you know, by the number of people whose lives are going to be, you know, damaged or gutted or eviscerated by planetary, you know, insult, then this is the worst time in human history. We've never lived in a world more dangerous, and our capacity to do enormous, unimaginable damage increases, you know, with each decade. So I think that people like Pinker are doing a disservice. What I like about the more cautious, optimistic tones in some of these other books, including the Sapolsky book, is it's good and well to say we've seen some good, things have improved, but we can't take it for granted. And here are the problems that face us, and we need to be vigilant. We need to be more than vigilant. We need to be actively working to make sure of these many branching futures, the one where we continue to do better is the one we stay on. And that's not going to happen by itself. It's not going to happen with status quo. Pinker is the prince of status quo. He's the guy who tells us we're doing all right. We got here through, you know, capitalism and democracy, and we should just keep doing what we're doing, and we'll continue to.
Have you ever talked to him?
Yeah, I mean, I've talked to him many times, or a number of times. He's a sensible guy. I mean, he's, you know, you might expect him to be like a, I don't know, neocon or something like that. First of all, he's Canadian. Like, they don't make neocons in Canada. Like, but you know, he's not, doesn't have the profile of somebody you would expect to be an apologist for, you know, more or less right-wing political agenda. And he's not. I mean, he is. But I do think, you know, I think he has attitudes towards race and gender that are really seriously problematic.
Right. I do too.
You know, don't make the light of day, but some of which do. And I think he's someone who, you know, to a great extent has, maybe because he's in a position of considerable comfort and privilege, has bought into the view that, you know, lives are going pretty well. It's a numbers game. You can talk about homicide being, you know, better than it was, you know, in the 19th century or something like that, or even the 1970s. But there are a lot of communities that are ravaged by homicide, where, you know, fatalities to violence are norm and part of everyone's life. You know, many people in our country, you know, face that threat daily. And, you know, all too many Americans know somebody who's died from gun violence. And that's a, you know, a point where you say, it doesn't matter if the rates are better now than they were in 1975. That's not the measure. The measure, we should be asking, why is this still going on in an affluent nation?
Yeah, and it's kind of like with healthcare is a good example. Like, people are like, yeah, but, you know, there's this many people that have great insurance, and it's like, okay, yeah, but we still have all of these people that are dying every year. And then people say things like, well, the lines aren't as long as they are in Canada. And it's like, okay, but we have a higher death rate in Canada per capita. I don't know. It's cognitive bias, honestly. I mean, that's all it is. Because if you look at the data, it doesn't, like the data on healthcare, it doesn't go well with like whatever people are saying. You know, it doesn't, you know, that there's tons of data suggesting that America is seriously behind the rest of the world in healthcare. And in tons of measurement, there's like 2 where we lead the world in, compared to hundreds of other metrics. And, you know, like my stepdad emailed me last week and said something along the lines of like, hey, have you seen this? Like, we have more ICU beds per capita. And I was like, is that how you want to measure like whether or not we have a great healthcare system? Is how many ICU beds we have per capita? Don't you think that there could be more things to measure healthcare with? Like, I don't know, how many people have it? How many people can get into the ICU beds?
Right, how are they distributed?
Yeah, why are we looking at ICU beds? Is it because people only go there when they're in extreme pain extreme, life or death situations. And but yeah, it's the same thing with Pinker. Like my outlook, I told my wife this morning, like I feel like you have changed my we have not even really talked that much, which is really interesting. But you've changed my perspective on so many things. And I had this going on before I met you, which was like, I kind of always looked up to Sam Harris, and I kind of always looked up to like Dawkins a little bit, and I always looked up to a lot of I never really I know Dan Dennett has done a lot of cool work with consciousness and stuff, but I disagree with a lot of other stuff that Dan Dennett says. But so anyways, there's a lot of all these philosophers that I've always kind of looked up to. And it's interesting how, recently within the last 6 months, maybe it's because I've learned more about philosophy, I don't know, like my perspective on like the things that Sam Harris says is like really changed, like not that I'm trying to say anything bad about him, it's just interesting. Like I don't think he nails a lot of the points that he's trying to nail,
Yeah.
So
and there is one issue that's kind of related to Harris, which is, we talked last time about his argument where he says, okay, a world where there's a lot of pleasure is better than a world where, there's a lot of pain or global pain. It's an argument to try and motivate utilitarianism. But, so I think that view utilitarianism and that argument are problematic. Putting that aside, there's a question, how do you ground ethics without God? And his way of doing it is saying that happiness is intrinsically good and anything other than happiness is intrinsically bad. And we don't buy that. But then the question is, how do you do it? And I think one part of the answer to that question is very, very simple. And it's just the principle of self-defense. Don't tread on me. If you're stepping on me, if you're stepping on my foot, I am going to be motivated to get you off my foot, and I'm going to fight for that. And I think if we credit the advances in our world, Pinker talks about, greater access to employment for women, for example. If we credit that to capitalism and democracy, we're making a big mistake, because capitalism and democracy have by design been against that. The people who are in power, have possession of power, are threatened by those who are disenfranchised gaining more power. They lose when more people come in. Some of them do. The U.S. Constitution was designed to reduce the number of voters to just people, white men with property. And there was incredible anxiety about extending the vote. If you look at disenfranchisement of felons in America, not every state does it, but for the states that disenfranchise felons, that's tens of thousands of people who can't vote. The margins of elections deciding who gets elected are almost always smaller than the number of felons in the states that have this restriction. And if all those felons could vote, that vote wouldn't be evenly divided across both sides. A lot of those felons would have interests in common, and they'd be fighting for greater opportunity, for instance, in ways that would lead them to vote for the other candidate. So elections are being decided by these structural limits on things like democracy. Why are women in the workplace? It's not because capitalists in power said, we want more women in the workplace. It's because somebody was stepping on their toes, and they said, we're not going to take it anymore.
Yeah,
and
they fought back.
And they fought back.
Yeah.
So the advances in society are not created by the generosity of the capitalist corporate machine. They're created by people who are struggling under the weight of that to find their place in the world. And I do think if there's any hope for healthcare reform, if there's any hope on any of these fronts, mass incarceration, it's going to be the activists, it's going to be the people who've suffered under these regimes who are going to fight. And those fights are ongoing and they're difficult. But if there's any hope for progress, it's that people in pain, will find ways to stand up. And I do, think that against the background of the Harris question, how do you get an ethics without God? The answer is the ethics without God just comes from the increase in share of power, equality, creature comforts that comes from those who have been exploited rising up. We credit the Civil War with the end of American slavery, or look at this anti-slavery movement as a bunch of white folks, often Christian folks, some capitalists who said we want a different society. But why, after hundreds of years, was there suddenly this global awakening of people in power that led to this radical policy change? That narrative is just false. The real narrative is that enslaved people were regularly rebelling. The constant revolts were becoming harder and harder to enforce. The population of enslaved people was outnumbering the population of planters, and it was an unsustainable system. And I think that, even though alliances were then formed between enslaved people and non-enslaved people, it was only because enslaved people were shouting out against injustice that this ever happened. If they remained inactive and silent, if they didn't, fight, rebel, run away, refuse to work, we probably still live in a society that used slaves. We still do. There are more people enslaved today than there were enslaved during the height of the transatlantic slave trade. Not per capita because the population has grown, but there are millions and millions of people working in forms of slavery and indentured servitude. And the capitalist machine depends on that. But
oh yeah. Like Africa is the most horrifically abused
Africa was conquered.
Continent.
The scramble for Africa in the space of a couple of decades. European powers, divided the country. They sat in committee meetings and went and divided the country, largely using machine guns, using forms of arms that were just, greater than anything that the indigenous population could resist. And often under humanitarian pretext, saying they're going to stop slavery in Africa, they're going to create civilization in Africa, they're going to do a tinker job and engage in the civilizing process in Africa. But it was all for economic control. And we still have that control. White Western world still controls Africa because when they left, when independence came to African nations, the mineral wealth remained in foreign white hands. So these countries that are extremely well off sometimes have some, corrupt leaders who are making deals with the people who actually own the mines to, line their pockets and make sure that the mine owners remain protected. Because if they were to lift those protections, the populations would and should rise up against them and reclaim their own natural resources. Until that happens, Africa will remain in a state of economic underdevelopment. So
I have this like fantasy of going over there and going over to like the DRC and like helping just fight the fucked up forces that are there. And, exactly. It's like a fantasy of mine. I have dreamt about it for so long. I follow Congo news very closely. I don't know why the Congo over any other country in Africa, but for some reason I just have this like really weird obsession with the Congo and how it's just ravaged, constantly.
Yeah, well, the Congo had the colonial division of Africa worked out worse in some places than others, and Congo, was among the worst. The Belgians, King Leopold was really terrible. But, you look at, more recent case, the youngest country in the world is South Sudan. And South Sudan is this very weird thing where Sudan and South Sudan are basically now puppets militarily and economically of China and the US. And all these Christian missionary groups have moved into South Sudan and used their kind of ethical mission as a pretext for a kind of government takeover. But really, this is just a thinly veiled effort to keep the wealth of those countries in control of these foreign superpowers. And this is the norm. This is how, so we think about going back to the slavery case. Is the democratic capitalist machine responsible for ending slavery? Was that the the good owners of power and wealth coming in and saying, let's end this out of some moment of moral enlightenment. Well, if that were true, the same owners of power and wealth wouldn't be preventing these things from going on globally today. They're not only not preventing them, they are the cause. Slavery exists today because of capitalism. Even Britain, which illegalized slavery in 1833, continued to allow slavery in India. It continued to trade with the United States and other slave economies. In every way, countries that can sort of wipe their hands and say, we don't do that here, benefit economically from it being done somewhere else. And until the places where this oppression goes on get some pushback from the people who are oppressed, the system will continue.
Yeah, I don't even know, man. This is why I'm like such a depressive person. There's a podcast that I recorded like by myself maybe a year ago or something, and I think I might have even cried on the podcast because I was like thinking about the Congo and just how fucked it is. And I mean, I don't know what to do, you know. It's like, it's so frustrating because all I want to do is help them, and there's so much of that all over the world, you know. It's not just them, and there's so much of it here, and I don't know what to do here even. And it's like, it's really frustrating because I just think like the amount of wealth in the world, it's insane. Like Jeff Bezos could go and solve a ton of problems in Africa if he wanted to. He could and he could still be a billionaire. He could go and spend $130 billion in Africa and he'd still be extremely wealthy, you know?
Oh yeah, no, it's nuts. I mean, his wealth is greater than multiple, you know, economies, multiple African economies put together. So, you know, his personal intake is more than the GNP of multiple countries in Africa together. That's problematic. Obviously, there has been a movement to get some of the 1% to pledge giving away their wealth or large parts of their wealth. You know, we applaud some of these people who do foundations like Bill Gates for giving away, you know, massive sums of money. But the truth is, relative to what they hold, they're actually less generous.
Oh yeah.
Than, you know,
there's that book, Winners Take All. Have you read that?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah.
That's precisely the argument.
Well, I know. And Jeff, sorry, I don't mean to interrupt you.
No, please.
Jeff Bezos just like pledged $10 billion to global warming, and everybody's like, yeah, this is so great. And I'm like, he's doing it. He's the guy that's like responsible for the global warming. What are we saluting here? You know what I mean? Exactly. $10 billion, big fucking deal. He's worth 150. It's like me buying a soda, and he's the reason why it's happening. Yeah. His freight is destroying the planet. He's not helping global warming.
Yeah. I mean, the techno optimist is going to reply, well, because these guys are destroying the environment but want to stay in business, they have a personal stake in trying to solve the problem. I think the error in that logic is the assumption that the problem can be solved. That the problem can be solved without really radical change. That we just throw the right technology at it. Throwing $10 billion at it is not going to solve it because. It's not that kind of problem.
Right,
it's a behavioral problem. It's a problem in how we live our lives. You know, you need to change values, not invest in some.
Elon Musk is like the only hope of a billionaire trying to better this stuff. Like if Jeff Bezos said, hey, Elon, why don't we come up with solar powered freight ships? Then I'd be saluting him. You know what I mean?
Yeah. But. Yeah, no, I think he is better on this score. But you know, I think this is kind of an inevitable product of the capitalist machine. I mean, another measure that Pinker doesn't talk about is income inequality, and you know, the fact that such a small number of people are in possession in such a high percentage of the world's wealth is you know, really unprecedented, and it's very unpredictable. We don't know where that's going to go. Is that going to lead to an era of people on high suddenly becoming responsible and taking care of the needs of everyone else? We'd like to think so, but what's in it for them? You know, there's a point at which the incentive structure of capitalism is always to exploit to the extent you can get away with it. And
Jeff Bezos clearly does not give a shit. I mean, he's like, he's like one of the worst examples of a billionaire, in my opinion. I just think like he has this whole like, yeah, we're just here for the customers or whatever, but he's only there for the profit. And he proves it by the way he treats his employees, and he proves it by the way he I don't know, like I always hear people like make the argument like, well, you know, it gives people the opportunity to like become self-employed. They can sell their stuff on there, and Jeff Bezos always ends up like buying these little companies out.
Oh yeah.
You know,
I mean, small businesses are gone.
They're gone. And this is a problem I think a lot about, like the Amazon problem. And I don't have any idea how to broach it, you know?
I mean, globalization in general. I mean, I grew up in a very different New York. When I grew up in New York City, you know, there were no chain stores. Like there were a few, but you know, like Walgreens or Woolworths, but the vast majority of shops on any given street were, you know, owned by a local person who lived in the neighborhood, a private individual.
Right.
And that's all gone. There's no reason to ever go to one of these famous cities because
that's a good point. Yeah.
You can walk through the streets of Prague and they're going to have Zara and H&M and exactly like literally the same shops you'd see in Midtown Manhattan or any.
I never even thought about that actually.
Or Taipei. I mean, it's pretty uniform at this point. So, you know, you could go to look at the architecture, but it's basically a single set of companies that that offer goods at this point. So that's depressing. I do think, I mean, both in terms of who is controlled, the ownership of businesses distributes wealth and power, but it's also, you know, opportunities for innovation, opportunities for cultures to develop in different ways. The idea that the things you can only get in one place and not in another is part of the richness of our species, that we're able to, you know, do so many different versions of the human life. And as that becomes more homogenous, you know, people sometimes define genocide as the elimination of a cultural group. And capitalism of this global kind is eliminating culture. It's flattening the world in ways that make differences evaporate. And once we have a single culture, you know, we've lost it. We've lost something. And that single culture is not going to be determined bottom up. It's not going to be determined by individuals who, you know, have great ideas and things they want to share. It's going to be dictated by big corporations who are always going to cater to mass taste. They're always going to look for the thing that's going to sell the most products, not the niche market. So yeah, I do think we're entering times where the world that I grew up in anyway is gone and there's no going back. Well, the internet in some way is the best hope because we can create, you know, little boutique interests in some, you know, form of music, for instance, that only, you know, a few people are interested in.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
But the internet is really vulnerable. And I don't think the internet will remain as free, as democratic as it currently is.
Yeah. So, okay. So 2 more questions because we've been talking for 2 hours and I, you know, I could talk to you for the rest of my life, but I'm sure you'd want to hang out with your family. So
it's cocktail time.
Yeah, totally. So 2 questions. Actually, I need to look at my book to, okay. So this one might take a couple minutes to talk about, but are you okay with that?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So conspiracy thinking.
Yeah.
So lately I've been seeing a lot of this like 5G. I don't know if are you on social media? You're probably not on social media, but so lately I've been seeing a lot of, have you heard about 5G? You know, there's like a conspiracy about 5G. Have you heard about the conspiracy of 5G?
Well, there have been all kinds of crazy things said about 5G. So maybe not which the 5G.
Well, it's really interesting because it's, I mean, like as someone that's taken physics classes and stuff, it's pretty baseless, you know? But it's the idea that this like these radio waves that it's producing is going to like somehow change your cells and give you cancer.
Okay. Yeah.
So
a lot of like memes joking about, you know, 5G carrying COVID-19 and things like that.
Exactly. So so earlier I talked about nationalism.
Yeah.
and how I'm afraid of nationalism rising up. But another concern that I have with everybody being stuck at home with nothing but time on their hands is that they're going to like continue to research conspiracy theories. And I think that I've seen a huge uptick in conspiracies lately,
Yeah.
and I've been like pretty vigilant about trying to like um, battle them. I don't know. I made a couple videos about it, and I've talked to a few people about it and stuff like that. But what do you think is up with that? Like, why do you think that conspiracies are so um, seductive?
Yeah, there's both psychological research, but also a kind of small group of philosophers who are really interested in conspiracy theories and
I
epistemology
am.
of conspiracy
Me
have
too.
developed all kinds of answers to this question. So I'll speak from my very non-expert position on this. Like with everything, there are multiple answers. But, I think that conspiracy thinking can, first of all, reflect a general sense of powerlessness that we have. The truth is we don't need to cook up conspiracies to recognize the fact that, basically all of us are living in a world that somebody else authored, and we are pawns in that great project, and there are systems of power that are accessible only to a very narrow elite, and they're going to call the shots no matter how much we yell and scream. So I think conspiracies speak to this general recognition of being marginalized. And I think for a great many people, that is core to how they experience life in the world, because it's true. And conspiracies are in some ways just, one might even say, recreation. They're kind of an enjoyable way to turn the reality of oppressive power into something that has more narrative appeal. When you turn it into a kind of cinematic yarn about, some hidden evil power or some new technology or some alien force, you're in effect making the misery of living, under the thumb of the man into something that sounds cooler.
Yeah.
But I think the other thing is it's hard to have a blanket skepticism about conspiracy theories. Even the very project of entertaining really radical or extreme views. I have a PhD student in my program who's writing a dissertation about this in the history of science. People who defend fringe accounts are doing a real service because they're pushing the imagination in new directions. They're forcing the establishment community to shore up its case. And they do, from time to time, just hit on something that turns out to be, if not exactly right, opens up an avenue of investigation that turns out to be really fertile. So
Well,
I think she's dead right in the history of science, and she's making a really powerful case for this. But I think, too, there are conspiracy theorists who, even though the details of their accounts haven't turned out to be right, there have been plenty of cases. I mean, Watergate was one of them. There have been plenty of cases where it turns out that there are wheelings and dealings among the powerful that do need to be exposed.
My biggest issue with them is that they take away from the real conspiracies going on, like Amazon.
Fair enough.
You know what I mean? Like Amazon. I mean, it's not that it's a conspiracy, but it's a real thing that real people are doing that's really destroying the earth, and they really don't give a shit. And meanwhile, there's people talking about flat Earth. It's like, I don't know. It's an interesting.
Yeah, but flat Earth is just kind of, it's almost, it's indulgence in a certain kind of fantasy again. It is, and I agree, it has the downside that if you spend your life dealing with,
I know people that really, really believe it.
I'm sure they're true believers, but it is, given finite time, allocation of a Hume, David Hume is this idea that, basically when you're competing between two explanations, take the one that's most consistent with what's well established, what's confirmed. Never go for the more outlandish one. So he says we should never believe in miracles, because every time there's a miracle, there's always an explanation that's non-miraculous. Here's a simple one. Every time somebody reports seeing a miracle, You could say another thing could have happened. They could have had an extremely vivid hallucination. And somebody would say, that's an incredibly ridiculous way to dismiss that. I mean, extreme hallucinations out of the blue for somebody who's never hallucinated, that would never happen. But the reply to that is, no, that at least is consistent with what we know about physical law and psychology. That could happen. The miracle, which violates the laws of physics, which is totally unprecedented, which never happens anywhere to anyone, that's far less probable than a freak case of isolated one-off vivid hallucination.
Yeah.
So explanations that fit within our framework are always more plausible than the ones that are extreme or radical. But I think that view as a general rule of thumb is fine. But what we miss out on by pursuing it too dogmatically is that some of these views that are peripheral or fringe or are improbable still may benefit us by, engaging those who defended the establishment views in the kind of conversation that forces us to undergird, examine, and shore up our dogmas so we can be more confident in what we take in as received view. And in many domains, the received view is undersupported. There are lots of things we've come to accept fairly blindly, including things like the machinations of government, including things like the benign nature of technology. And if we go through the course of our days feeling like the internet is a safe place or some new broadband technology is only going to be good for us, without stepping back to prove that that's true, we will open ourselves up to vulnerabilities. So I think that the role of conspiracy theorists is, in that respect, valuable. Not because they're saying things that are true, but because they make us do the due diligence we need to do to have adequate confidence in our truth and secure ourselves against non-actual sort of conspiracies that could, in fact, occur in the future. I mean, suppose that people anxious about 5G created enough momentum that the purveyors of this technology had to build in safeguards to reassure them that this could not be used for mind control. Those safeguards might not be necessary right now, but maybe down the line they'll do some good for us. So
yeah, that's a good point.
I'm a little bit more laissez-faire about conspiracy theories. I kind of say, let them bloom, address them, don't just go unanswered, because the answering of them is itself a constructive exercise. But once we recognize that, we can also recognize that the conspiracy theories motivate us to engage in that exercise.
Cool. Yeah, I think that's a really good answer. Next thing is, do you sell your art?
No, I don't make art. I feel like art for me, I have an art background. I love art. Art is really important to me. But the actual making of drawing, things like that I do very regularly is really therapeutic. I do it for me. But right now I'm writing this graphic novel, and my hope is to somehow find the time to make that a reality one day. And maybe that's opening up the door to making art be a more central part of my life than it has been. So I'd love the correct answer to that question to be not yet.
Well, now I'm gonna have to force you to sell me some of your art, because I want some Jesse Prinz original.
One other thing I should say is I don't sell art, but I give art away. So
okay, well, even better. Well, I definitely want some. Okay, I'm gonna hit stop on the recording on this.
Okay.